History as it happens, December 14th, 2021. Ranking the Presidents, Part 1.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed.
Unless we in America work to preserve the peace, there will be no peace. Unless we in America work to preserve freedom, there will be no freedom.
We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth.
From Washington to Jackson to Lincoln, from Grant to Roosevelt to Wilson, then Roosevelt again, from Kennedy to Nixon, from Reagan to Trump. We've had 45 presidents, not counting our current one. Some were great, some were not, and many fall somewhere in between. Let's try to rank them next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
It's very important for us to try to figure out what it is that we're looking for in a successful, highly qualified, competent president.
My favorite inaugural address is not one I heard at the time it was delivered. In fact, I've never heard it delivered. But even at the time, most people had no choice but to read it. There was no radio or TV or electronic amplification, and the speaker wasn't known for a booming voice. But millions of people continue to read this inaugural address every year because the words are etched in the wall at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Indulge me for a moment. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all. No one matches Abraham Lincoln's eloquence, his leadership during the most grave crisis in U.S. history. He helped save the Union, so Lincoln is at the top of my list when it comes to ranking the presidents. But who should be next? This episode is the first of a 2-episode series. In Part 1, we're going to talk about our finest presidents, and in Part 2, which will be our next episode, we're going to cover our worst leaders, as well as those who are difficult to rank, the in-betweeners. But be warned, we won't get to all 44, and I'm not sure that would be very entertaining to listen to anyway. But you can blame me, the host, if we don't get to someone you wanted to hear about. But in the interest of keeping these podcasts to a manageable duration, we're not going to analyze all 44 presidents on the list. And yeah, I said 44, not 46, because we're not going to discuss Joe Biden yet, and because Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States, the only guy to serve non-consecutive terms. So I got the idea for doing these episodes after reading the most recent Siena College Research Institute survey of U.S. presidents. It's been around since 1982, and a new one came out this year. Historians, political scientists rank the presidents across 20 different categories. But we have our own 2 presidential historians to rely upon, and both have been guests on the podcast before. Jeremi Suri of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the host of This Is Democracy podcast, and Jeffrey Engel, founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. He also hosts a podcast, The Past, the Promise, the Presidency. It's a lot of P's in there. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back.
Good to talk to you always.
And Jeremi Suri, good to see you again, too.
Nice to talk with you, Martin.
So Siena College Research Institute, they periodically put out a survey of the U.S. presidents. They interview historians, scholars such as yourself who study this stuff, and they rank the presidents across 20 different categories. I don't know if that's the best way, but it's the way they do it. For instance, party leadership, intelligence, integrity, relationship with Congress, court appointments, leadership ability, overall ability. Before we start our own rankings, what should be the criteria? Jeffrey Engel, let's start with you.
You know, the criteria can be, in essence, whatever the person who's asking wants it to be, in the sense that we could ask if a president is influential, whether they have great consequence of their policies over the long term, good or bad. We could ask, as I like to do in my strategy class, whether or not a president achieved the things that he or she wanted to do. I'm actually shocked, by the way, to realize how many presidents don't actually have a plan and a vision for where they want to go. And I think the key thing to remember is that whatever criteria you use actually tells you more about yourself than about the president. Because if you see policies as good or bad over time, especially in our politically polarized day today, what that really is doing is revealing your own politics and your own sentiment. So the same person who could say FDR was wonderful because he expanded the social safety net could also turn around and say FDR was terrible because he expanded the social safety net. So it really tells you more about yourself than about the president.
Jeremi Suri, this does have a legitimate purpose, to Jeffrey's point. We can have a partisan argument about it, but there is some scholarly purpose to this, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very important for us to try to figure out what it is that we're looking for in a successful, highly qualified, competent president. And the best way to think that through is to look over the course of our more than 200 years of history and to try to figure out what have been the elements that have led to success in certain circumstances and what have not in other circumstances. Now, I think all historians who participate in these rankings would say that certain presidents shine during moments of crises, but that doesn't mean that you want a crisis and that you want presidents to have to be leading in those moments. So we also have to ask ourselves, what are the circumstances in the current moment when we're judging presidents from different moments in the past? Someone like Franklin Roosevelt looks a lot better in a moment like our world today. He didn't look as good to many Americans in the early 1980s when they felt government was doing too much in their lives. At a moment today when people are suffering from difficult health conditions, difficult economic conditions, Franklin Roosevelt looks a lot better to some. So these rankings tell us not just about who we are as the rankers, they tell us about the moment that we're in.
In my view, you have to start with Lincoln. The survey I mentioned has Washington number one, but let's start with Lincoln. Jeremy, we'll pick back up with you. Why is Lincoln, in your view, if not the best, near the top?
I think anyone who reads anything from Abraham Lincoln is immediately struck by the ability of this man to use words to motivate, mobilize, and explain. If people like to say that Winston Churchill mobilized the English language for war, Abraham Lincoln mobilized and transformed the American use of English for political achievement. And his words still sing out to us. And then you combine that with the circumstances he was in, the profundity of the crisis he faced, and his own background as a poor country boy. And you see the arc of his development, his love of the country, and his ability to put that into words. It's not only that makes him a great president, it makes him a great figure. He is one of the outstanding figures in American history, full stop.
Jeffrey.
Well, just for the sake of discussion, I'll paint the opposite case in a sense. And by the way, obviously, Lincoln's at the top. So this is all in some ways a theoretical exercise. But the truth is, I think that Lincoln benefits from a lot of the ways in which we are limited in how we view presidents, not least of which is timing, which is to say that Lincoln, sadly, goes out on top. And one has to ask the question, what would have happened if Lincoln had continued on as president in a second term with messy Reconstruction, which I think, frankly, we can still see the remnants of today. I think that we might have viewed him historically as a president who preserved the Union during the war and then got bogged down in politics and was never able to achieve greatness again, absent the tension of war. I also think you can make the argument that Lincoln was ineffective in his motivations in many ways, at least until 1864. Remember, Lincoln, if you had to place bets in the summer of 64, you would have gotten really good odds that he would not get reelected. He actually was preparing for his own transition, if you will, mentally to the next administration, which he feared might actually be a Democratic administration that would seek peace. No better example exists than the fact that he was not able to get his generals fighting if you will, for several years, at least especially in the Northern Virginia area. So there's a sense in which we could look at Lincoln and say, man had an incredible spiritual course and had incredible moral guidance, but at the same time was not able actually to effectively motivate people, at least not until the weight of the Union power began to overcome the Confederacy. Now, again, that's all in the context of Lincoln was great, Jeff says, but let's consider the complexities.
I think if you look at Lincoln versus his predecessor, Buchanan, many of the same opportunities. One did not lift a finger to save the Union. The other did. And about Jeremi Suri, some of these criteria, one is ability to compromise, I believe. Lincoln was not a compromiser when it came to the key issue of the day, the expansion of slavery.
Well, that's true. And Jeff's points are spot on. We don't know what Lincoln would have done if he had not been assassinated in April of 1865. But we do know he was preceded, as you said, Martin, by one of the least effective presidents, James Buchanan. And he was preceded by one of the worst American presidents, Andrew Johnson. And I've actually just finished a book on this, so this is foremost in my mind. Andrew Johnson becomes virtual dictator for 7 months after Lincoln's assassination because Congress is not even in session. This man who never should have been anywhere close to the White House. So one of the reasons Lincoln looks so great, this just follows on Jeff's point, is because his predecessor and successor are so horrible. He really stands out. In fact, he stands out for most of his successors. You can make a case for Ulysses Grant. Lincoln was a compromiser, Martin, in the sense that he was a supreme politician. This is a point I didn't bring up. It's certainly obvious when you contrast him, another figure I've just been writing about, Ulysses Grant, who was an incredible figure in his own right, but a terrible politician. Lincoln had some issues, such as the expansion of slavery, that he was not willing to compromise on. But he had many, many other issues that he was definitely compromising on. And beyond that, it's not just the ability to compromise. It seems to me compromise doesn't mean always getting half a loaf. It's the ability to manipulate and make deals with people who often disagree with you that can move the ball forward on the issues you care most about. That is the hardest element of politics today. It was very difficult in Lincoln's time. And the fact that he was able to keep Northern Unionists who were opposed to the abolition of slavery on board with the Union cause. And as Jeff said, stand for election during a war when he could have made an excuse not to stand for an election. I can think of a later president who probably wouldn't have. That really shows us Lincoln's greatness here. And the fact that he could then run that election and win that election legitimately, by the way, using mail-in ballots for the first time, allowing Union soldiers to vote by mail. That really signals not just his ability to compromise, Martin, as you put it, his ability to be an effective politician, which has to be one of our key criteria in assessing any president.
And he kept the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. See, I know a little bit about it.
And he kept the English out of the war. One of the biggest diplomatic difficulties he confronted was preventing the English from recognizing the Confederacy.
Jeffrey, Lincoln has always been hated by the neo-Confederates. They accuse him of abusing the Constitution, becoming a tyrant. How do you deconstruct those arguments? I don't buy them. How about you?
It's axiomatic in American wars that we tend to view the other side's leader as a tyrant. It's a good rallying cry in many ways. But if we want to go back and think about Lincoln's legitimacy and the importance of his understanding the ability to compromise and his ability to appreciate politics, the first thing we have to get on the table, of course, is that one of the reasons that Lincoln is at the top of the list, on the Mount Rushmore, if you will, is that he had an incredible crisis. He had the worst crisis in American history. And as we've just praised him for standing for election in 1864 and for being willing to be a compromiser and a good politician, let's not forget that when he stood for election in 1860, everybody knew that his election was going to break the Union, that the South, where he was not even on the ballot throughout most of the South, was going to break away if he won. So again, we have to balance the fact that Lincoln had a moral vision of where he wanted to go. He thought that certain things could not be compromised on, the expansion of slavery being first and foremost. But he also knew that to make this omelet was going to require breaking a whole lot of eggs.
One more point about Lincoln, and then we have to move on, because as mentioned at the top, we could spend all day discussing just Lincoln. When it comes to Lincoln today, how he is, I think, misunderstood by some on the left who look at what he said during the Lincoln-Douglas debates about black people and some of his other comments on race earlier in his career. I think they're getting Lincoln wrong. I think they're flattening him based on these few instances where he spoke in ways that we would today consider to be racist.
You're exactly right in that we've tend to flatten these characters in our current politics. And one of the things I'm about to say is indisputable, I think, and yet also offensive to half the people who are listening, which is that Lincoln was, by our definition, a racist. Lincoln did not believe in the equality of all the races. He believed in emancipation by the end of his life. He believed that there should not be slavery. He didn't think that one race should rule over another. But let's not forget that Lincoln pondered what to do with the fact that he didn't think blacks and whites really belonged together and could exist together. Lincoln was, from time to time, a proponent of removing African Americans back to Africa.
Voluntarily, colonization.
He appreciated it was actually a logistical impossibility, but he liked the concept. It's a very difficult bag that we, again, shine a light on ourselves when we ask these questions about the past.
He grew from that. He grew from that, though.
Right. Right. I was just going to make that point, Martin, building on what Jeff said. I think one of the most outstanding features Lincoln has is he's far from perfect, but his ability to grow and change in the office, which is another criterion we should look at. There's no doubt that Lincoln's views on race were not, shall we say, as progressive as many people would like them to be today. And so he does buy into a lot of issues, a lot of perspectives that we today would call racist. But he was radical for his time, at least by the end of his presidency. His last public speech is where he embraces voting by African-American Union soldiers in Louisiana.
That's right.
And that is actually what triggers John Wilkes Booth to kill him. John Wilkes Booth is actually listening to Lincoln when Lincoln speaks from the White House portico, and then decides that he can't deal with African-Americans voting in the South. Now, if we look at Lincoln's words, he doesn't say all African-American men should have the right to vote. He says those who are worthy and have served in the Union cause. So he's not embracing full suffrage for African Americans. He's not embracing the 15th Amendment, which was not even on the table yet. But he is embracing a radical position, even for many of the most progressive Republicans of his time, which is that these black men who served in the Union Army have a right to vote when they go back to the places where they were formerly slaves. And I just want to underline how radical a view that was for people in its time. Far from where we are today, but radical in its moment. And as Jeff pointed out, that's not a view Lincoln had in 1860. It's a view he came to by 1865.
Lincoln was faced with, I think we all agree, the biggest crisis in American history. And he got it more right than wrong in a situation where no one would have gotten it all right. So on the note of timing, Franklin Roosevelt, had he been elected in 1928, probably would not be remembered today as a great president. In my view, Roosevelt was the greatest president of the 20th century. Jeffrey Engel, you go first.
I feel like FDR is actually in Jeremy's wheelhouse, so I'm curious to hear what he has to say. But let me just preface it by saying, you've hit the nail on the head. We cannot understand Roosevelt without the Depression. And a Roosevelt presidency in 28, absent the stock market crash and everything that we know follows, I think he would have been a traditional conservative Democrat. Remember, FDR was not in favor of expanding the social safety net until the Depression hit. And then even then was, I would argue, uncomfortable with it ideologically. He's always believed in balanced budgets. So it's not just what does FDR look like without the Depression. It's that we can't even evaluate the way he would have governed as president without the Depression, which I think is actually his greatest asset, that he was able to fit the times and be malleable and not just learn in office, but be willing to do things that he thought were necessary, even when he didn't necessarily think that they were ideologically correct.
And Jeremy, as you know, the New Deal did not end the Depression. Roosevelt's goal was to establish stability and security in American life against the vicissitudes of life in a capitalist society, to borrow a term from David M. Kennedy. And I think that's where FDR shines, in addition to his leadership before and during World War II.
Absolutely. Now, we do have a way of assessing what an FDR presidency would look like in 28. He was, of course, elected governor of New York then. And he was governor of New York before the Depression, before the stock market crash, and during and in those first days. And one of the biggest contrasts between Roosevelt and his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, is how at the same moment, when they were both in executive positions, they reacted very differently. Herbert Hoover believed that this was a momentary dip in the economic cycle, and he believed, because he was Herbert Hoover and understood economics better than everyone else, that he should just do what he believed was the right thing to do, and everyone should just follow him. Franklin Roosevelt immediately reacted as governor of New York to seek out new ideas and to reach out to the public and to offer empathy, in this case to New York citizens of the state, particularly upstate New York, who were suffering considerably early on in the Great Depression. So we do have a difference in their styles, but Jeff's point is certainly on target that Roosevelt rose to the moment and found a voice he didn't have before. And this is something that Sam Rosenman, his chief speechwriter, said as well, that Roosevelt found a way to think about politics and articulate politics in a new way. I think what really distinguishes Franklin Roosevelt are not the New Deal policies that we can argue over that did enormous good for the country, but as you said, Martin, certainly did not take us out of the Great Depression. I think it's Roosevelt's ability to connect to American people and provide that intangible quality that comes up in almost all the oral histories, even oral histories from people who didn't vote for him, that he gave people a sense of meaning and a sense of hope when they felt they had lost that sense of hope. It's different from Lincoln. It's not rallying people really to war. It's rallying people to believe in themselves and their communities, and quite literally to get out of their homes, to go out and do things and connect with people. And that's what the spirit of the New Deal was all about. In that way, Franklin Roosevelt is not only the greatest president of the 20th century, he invents our modern politics. We think about presidents differently because of Franklin Roosevelt. And there's a reason why every president, including Ronald Reagan and Joe Biden, they try to find their inner Roosevelt and usually don't succeed. But that's what they're looking for.
Jeffrey, I have a question for you about Roosevelt and foreign policy. I know foreign policy is certainly your wheelhouse, but another point about FDR, David M. Kennedy brought this up in an interview. When Herbert Hoover was president, I think there was one person in the White House who would answer mail. When FDR became president and had this ability to connect with people, the political arts, with his use of radio and the fireside chats, I think they had to hire hundreds of people to start answering the White House mail.
I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen.
Foreign policy, FDR, I think this is an underrated, if that's possible, aspect of his 4 terms. Between 1935 and 1940, I believe Congress passed 5 separate neutrality laws, and that seems impossible to believe from our modern vantage point, given the extent of the American empire these days. But 5 different neutrality laws that tied the hands of the president during the worst international crisis, well, I guess ever, if you consider the outcome of World War II with 60 million people dead. FDR's leadership leading up to and during World War II has to place him near the top of this list, doesn't it, Jeffrey?
We in 2021, as you point out, after multiple generations of American empire, almost unquestioned American empire, have really lost the tone and the terrible tenor of the vicious debate over what to do with foreign policy before World War II. Arthur Schlesinger, famous historian, said that it was actually the worst public debate, the angriest days, he called them, of his entire life, which of course included Vietnam. Whether America should repeat the mistake of World War I and get involved in European and Asian affairs, or should engage as a force for good, was one that ripped families apart in the years leading up to World War II. So when I look back on Roosevelt, I am first and foremost more and more impressed by the man as time goes on. And also, I think I understand him less and less as time goes on, because he was so very good at moving public opinion on a personal level. I mean, his key aspect of his presidency, his most fundamental characteristic, was one of empathy, that he understood what Americans were going through, but also was therefore able to speak to Americans individually, which is why it's very difficult to understand exactly how Roosevelt moved American public opinion slowly over time, with a lot of help from the Nazis, by the way, slowly over time against the Nazi cause, because frankly, he did not necessarily do so overtly all the time, because many of the things he wanted to do and did were in violation of those neutrality acts, as you just mentioned. I mean, if you want to make a case for a president taking the commander-in-chief clause of the Constitution to unprecedented and dangerous tyrannical heights, you can make a good case for Roosevelt, too. Remember, we are essentially in a shooting war in the summer and fall of 1941, before the United States formally enters the war after Pearl Harbor. We're in a shooting war basically against congressional will, and solely because the president thought it was a good idea.
It's interesting how you phrase that. With some help from the Nazis, as terrible as the Nazis were as we look back on it now, at the time, and people knew how bad the Nazis were prior to World War II, with the persecution of Jews in Germany, it still wasn't enough because of the isolationist mindset.
Some of the most popular figures in the United States, including Charles Lindbergh, remained not only opposed to American intervention, but in some ways believers that Nazism was the wave of the future. And if you look across the 1930s, it did seem that the Nazi command economy had done better against the ravages of the Depression than many capitalist economies had. I always remind my students that if in the mid-1930s I told them that capitalism was going to be the dominant economic system of the next 100 years, and that at some point even large Asian countries like China and Japan would become part of this capitalist system, they would think I was absolutely crazy. It shows you how poor we are at anticipating the future. On the one hand, the outrageous, aggressive behavior of the Nazi regime that was evident to Roosevelt and those closest to Roosevelt from the mid-1930s was juxtaposed with not just a desire among Americans to avoid a repeat of World War I, but also a sense some had that, in fact, the Nazi regime wasn't as bad as it looked, that it had some positive elements. Think of our debates on Russia today. There still are people who will defend Vladimir Putin and will defend his aggressive behavior in Ukraine and elsewhere. And I'm not in any way making an equivalent analogy between Vladimir Putin and Adolf Hitler. But the point is that people, for their own political reasons, will see foreign tyrants as good or bad, depending on whether they serve their political agendas or not.
They like strong men, and that was one of Hitler's arguments, that parliamentary democracy doesn't work. Jeffrey, anything else to add about FDR before we move on?
Well, let me say that the argument that democracy doesn't work, especially in parliamentary or congressional politics, doesn't work, is a pretty persuasive one in 2021. I mean, have you had any conversation with anyone in the last 5 years where you said, boy, Congress really does a good job. Congress is efficient. That's the way that we should set up a system to get things done. Obviously, no. Can I take 15 seconds and ask a question to Jeremy?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, buddy. So here's the impossible question. You're the impossible presidency guy. When does Roosevelt believe that the United States is going to have to get into the war and do actual fighting?
I think as early as 1937, the quarantine speech in Chicago, he realizes that's the direction things are going. And I think it's more because of Japan than Germany, right? I think you're spot on that he's using executive authority despite congressional limits to move us in that direction as much as he can.
We really don't need me here. I'll just let you guys, you guys actually know what you're talking about.
Well, we go way back.
Yeah, but you're also right. We would just blab on for about 11, 12 hours.
That's exactly
I'm
right.
supposed to be keeping the trains running on time. Pardon the fascist. But, the right, especially the modern right, has accused Roosevelt of having a soft spot for Mussolini, or that he wanted to overturn capitalism. To both of your points, and then we'll move on from FDR. He wanted to save capitalism, and he identified fascism, what he called international gangsterism. And he knew that the West and the United States would eventually have to do something about it in the face of isolationism. All right, briefly, George Washington. Everyone loves George Washington. I think if you were to stop people on the street and say, name one piece of legislation George Washington signed while he was in office or something he did as president, they might have trouble. I might have trouble. But we all revere George Washington. So it sounds like a dumb question to even ask if George Washington belongs at or near the top of the list.
Yes. I don't see how you could not put him at the top. And I will say, as someone who, over the course of my career as a scholar, has returned to Washington on a number of occasions, he looks better and better with time. Wow. And the fact that it's not about legislation is really interesting, right? The three cases for Washington, and I think these are all overwhelming slam dunk cases very quickly. First of all, he creates the office. Article 2 of the Constitution is very vague. What we think of as the office is truly created by him in all of its best senses. Someone who brings the public together when he's doing his job, someone who actually works with Congress when he's doing his job, and someone who defends the integrity of the Union when he's doing his job. That's number one. Number two, he leaves, and he doesn't claim he has a right to come back. He doesn't claim that there was fake news that pushed him out. He really tries to be nonpartisan, and he also really believes that the office is one that should be held as a fiduciary responsibility temporarily, not as something you own because you were elected. And then third and most important, and I think Hamilton, the play, brings this out in its own strange way, in a way that's really enticing and alluring, and it's true, Washington manages a very partisan moment. Partisanship is not unique to our time. He might not belong to a party, though he leaned in the Federalist direction, but he manages two titans and the parties that develop behind them and gets the best out of the both of them. It's not that Hamilton runs the government. It's that Washington runs the government and gets the best out of Jefferson and Hamilton and many around them. So for all those reasons, he's the GOAT of presidents.
He also established federal authority by cracking down on the Whiskey Rebellion. Didn't want to pay their taxes.
Just to bring this out, most people don't know this. He is the first and last president to personally lead soldiers in war, as he does in the Whiskey Rebellion.
Jeffrey, briefly, anything to add to Jeremy's discourse on GW?
Jeremy's largely nailed it, in fact, entirely nailed it. I like to use as a sort of a Rorschach test for presidents to think of what's the one word that you associate with them. And for FDR, for example, it's empathy. For John Kennedy, I would say it's vigor. And for Washington, it's virtue. That the thing that made Washington so powerful as a leader, his integrity was never questioned. People might have disagreed with him and certainly did disagree with him. He actually was not the most popular president at the time. Well, he was the most popular president at the time because he was the first one, but you know what I mean.
I get your point.
It was impossible to question that his judgment was made in what he thought was in the best interest of the country, not necessarily his personal interests. And the virtue shines through to where I would argue that the most important moment that he had as president was when he chose to attend the Constitutional Convention in 1787, knowing that doing so was going to end the retirement that he desperately wanted after the Revolutionary War, knowing he was going to be drawn into politics and knowing that he was going to be the first leader of this country, that a job he really didn't want. That was really the moment where he said, I'm putting country first.
Washington understood that oftentimes you have most impact by giving up power.
That's right.
Not by seeking it at all costs.
Well, he set the precedent.
He does it twice, right? After the Revolution, he surrenders his command. And then after 8 years as president, he surrenders his command. And think about the history of the presidency. Some of the most impactful presidents are the presidents who didn't serve as long as they could, but actually willingly resigned.
So I'm going to wrap up this episode with a discussion about Ronald Reagan, but we want to touch on maybe one or two others before we get to Reagan. The survey I mentioned has Washington tops, then FDR number 2, Lincoln 3, and number 4, Jeffrey Engel, Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay, so if we change the nature of the list from greatest presidents to favorite presidents, Roosevelt's at the top of my list. I mean, and I think it's because he embodies so many of the virtues that I wish I had. You know, he is constantly energetic, plus he's a historian, so he writes history books. What's not to love about a president who can do that? And I think what I find really impressive about Theodore Roosevelt is that he was both the thoughtful man and also the active man. That he believed in getting things done and wanting things to get done. And yet, if we look at his actual record, the record actually is in some ways more impressive domestically and less impressive in terms of foreign policy events, which makes him even more impressive, by which I mean, we often think of Roosevelt as a bellicose, almost hawkish, warlike president who never got us into war and who actually worked incredibly hard behind the scenes to end several wars and to keep a war from breaking out in Europe that probably would have drawn the United States in. TR gets incredible points in my book for being thoughtful, active, and also knowing when to be quiet.
He was a force of nature.
Absolutely. And as Jeff said, he jumps off the page even 100 years after his death. I love the comment from one journalist at the time. He said, you shake Theodore Roosevelt's hand and then you have to go home and take a shower to wash him out of you. And how does he get into us in the way Jeff described and the way this journalist described? It's the sense of purpose that drives this man. I mean, he had a strong North Star, which was a stronger nation. And he pursued that with vigor, with creativity, and with a willingness to surround himself with people who thought in very different ways. People like Jacob Riis, who's writing about poverty in New York City, Jane Addams, one of the earliest, most important peace activists, as well as social activists within the United States. He brings these people from various different backgrounds together, and he pursues the national interest, as we would call it today, with such vigor, with such determination. It's hard not to be enthralled with that.
All right, gentlemen, as mentioned at the very top, we do not have time to go over every single president, top, bottom, in the middle. So let's do Dwight Eisenhower before we wrap up with Ronald Reagan and his place in history. Jeremy, you and I'll get each of you to discuss Ike briefly. Jeremy, you and I did an entire podcast about Ike. He looks pretty good today. His standing is, well, that survey has him number 9, so his standing is pretty high.
Yes, he looks good for a number of reasons. One is that, like Theodore Roosevelt, he does not get the United States into foreign wars. He, in fact, is president when we leave the Korean War, which was one of the worst wars of the 20th century. And that's saying a lot considering the number of wars in the 20th century. He also oversees the massive expansion of American military power. This is the positive side of the military-industrial complex. The negative side, of course, are all the commitments and all the costs that come with that, which he himself laments at the end of his presidency.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government.
And at home, to the surprise of many conservatives, he makes major investments that look very prescient, particularly in the interstate highway system, which is the largest single infrastructure investment before the recent infrastructure package passed by Democrats and some Republicans in the last year in the United States. Where Ike often falls short in people's views is on the issue of civil rights. He reluctantly and slowly sends forces down to Little Rock in 1957. He's not a strong supporter of Brown v. Board in 1954. And then also the use of covert operations, particularly in Guatemala and Iran. He sees these as successes in his presidency, and they're still seen as relative successes. They're alternatives to the long war that the United States fights in Vietnam, which Ike largely stays out of. But we also know that the covert operations undertaken in Guatemala and Iran that lead to the overthrow of governments in both of those societies create long-term instability, and in Iran are one of the main sources of conflict between the United States and Iran to this very day.
Jeffrey, before you jump in here, when it comes to the covert operations and toppling democratically elected leaders, I have trouble looking past that. Why, in your view, is Eisenhower a great president? Or maybe he isn't. We're allowed to disagree, but go ahead, Jeffrey.
I'm tempted to just say ditto on Jeremy, because I think that what is impressive to me about Eisenhower, first and foremost, is his restraint and also his ability to see long-term investments and long-term strategies. Remember, Eisenhower, his entire career is involved with big systems, no bigger, of course, than during World War II when he was commander in Europe. And so he understood long-term consequences. And so he invested not only in the United States, as Jeremy mentioned, but also in education. We get the American educational system we have today, which I think in many ways is currently crumbling because there is not an Eisenhower-like investment in education going on today, especially in public education at the college level. The one critique I would have in Eisenhower structurally is that he creates a broad system, but like so many leaders, he doesn't create a system that can be replicated without him in the center. In that Eisenhower was the one who could say, when the Pentagon wanted a new fighter plane or a new tank or a new whatever, he could say, I'm sorry, look at me. I'm the guy with the resume line that says saved Western civilization. And I can tell you, you don't need this. No other president was able to do that.
We're going to wrap up episode 1 or part 1 with Ronald Reagan. And I'll preface the Reagan discussion with this. Best presidents, worst presidents, top, bottom. How about consequential presidents? Ronald Reagan, without question, the most consequential American president of the second half of the 20th century. If FDR is the patron saint of the Democrats, Ronald Reagan is the patron saint of the Republican Party. So, Jeffrey, go ahead.
Well, he's a patron saint of the Republican Party before Trump. This actually, I used to tell my students before Trump that the single worst drinking game that you could play, not that I'm encouraging such things, but the single worst drinking game that you could play would be to watch a Republican presidential debate and take a shot every time someone said the word Reagan, because, you'd be dead within 5 minutes. That was not the case once Trump came in. Reagan is not venerated by Trump, and I think largely because Trump doesn't want to venerate anyone but himself. Our memory of Reagan is transforming literally day by day before our eyes, and that if we were having this conversation in 2015, the people on the right of the political spectrum would have, I think, a very different reaction to our conversation about Reagan than they would even only 5 years later.
Reagan was deeply conservative. He wasn't an anti-government fanatic, but certainly his ideology, at least in my view, has bred, in part, anti-government fanaticism that we're seeing today, that our own government is our enemy. Am I going too far, Jeremy?
No, I think that's accurate. I think that's actually his biggest impact, is to be the president who finally sticks a knife in the heart of the New Deal. And perhaps the New Deal is being resurrected now. But Reagan, as himself a fan of FDR, comes to believe, especially in the 1960s and 70s, when he's governor of California and then a national celebrity speaker, he comes to believe that the New Deal has gone too far. He was a proponent of it. He says to the end of his life that Franklin Roosevelt saved his family, quite literally. His father is on relief. His family survives because of New Deal relief. But nonetheless, he comes to believe that the New Deal has gone too far, and he shifts American politics in the direction of unraveling government programs. And that's most clearly evident when Bill Clinton is president, the most successful Democratic president of the late 20th century.
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know, and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over.
And so we see, as Jeff already alluded to, about 3 decades of unraveling of programs, unraveling of welfare programs, unraveling of education funding, unraveling of funding for women's health. The abortion debate is only a small part, in fact, of a larger debate over whether the government should provide health care, health assistance to indigent women and others. All of these programs are unraveled by Reagan. The irony is, at the same time that Reagan is unraveling government programs at home, he's infusing more spending and more government energy behind military activities, not necessarily diplomacy, but behind military activities. He oversees, to some extent, the end of the Cold War, or the beginning of the end of the Cold War, though George H.W. Bush, who Jeff has written the best biography of, George H.W. Bush is actually the figure who really is there at the end of the Cold War and really shepherds that process through on the American side. But Reagan certainly contributes to that in his relationship with Gorbachev in important ways. But it is important to say that Reagan's relationship with Gorbachev almost runs entirely against most of the programs he's put in place to that moment. He personally, like Eisenhower at the end of his presidency, makes a strong move toward peacemaking. But he set the stage for so many militaristic programs, most of the programs pursued that lead to the war in Iraq by people like Richard Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld are put in place by Reagan. So that's what makes his legacy, I think, very complex, Martin.
So, Jeffrey, about foreign policy and Reagan's role in de-escalating the Cold War. It was his more conciliatory, realistic, pragmatic side in his second term that de-escalated the Cold War. In my view, that's Reagan's greatest accomplishment.
One of the ways I like to understand Reagan is to think of him as he calls for the end of the Cold War, and even in the 1970s is saying the Soviet system can't survive because it can't provide for the moral or the economic or the social benefits as people want. Reagan is like the guy who commands the sun to rise, and then when it rises, takes credit for it. Because he was not alone in saying that the Soviet system was in trouble, not least of which were most Soviet leaders knew that they were in trouble. So he was in place when the collapse occurred. And I have to give him great credit, which I don't usually do for Reagan. I'm actually not a big at all Reagan fan, especially of his foreign policy. But I give him credit that when the time was ripe, he was willing to reach across the table and take the hand of a former adversary in hope of making that person a comrade and a friend, no pun intended.
And he did imbue the country with confidence. after a fairly miserable end to the 1970s.
This is a great point, actually. Just real quick. This is one of those things I love about being historians, that we can constantly learn as time goes on, and wisdom hopefully comes to us. But sometimes wisdom is given to us. I very clearly remember, about 10 years ago, lecturing on Reagan and talking about all the flaws and faults and inconsistencies and so on. And one person in the audience who I came to have as a close friend said, no, you don't understand. You weren't alive then, or at least weren't paying attention. He changed the attitude and he gave us a sense of optimism. And I cannot dispute that, nor can I quantify it, but I will say I think he's right. I think that is something that Reagan needs to get credit for.
So, Jeremy, final question before we wrap up this episode. Would you put Reagan among the top presidents?
No, I'd put him in the middle. I'd put him in the solid middle. He'd be B+ range, and I resist the great inflation of making middling great.
Well, that's a great segue, because when we pick this conversation up again in the next episode, we're going to talk about the tweeners, the people who are in between, in addition to the bottom dwellers. Final note, some of the names we did not get to who are in the Siena College Research Institute list among the greatest presidents: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, who was only president for a short time, and Woodrow Wilson is number 11. He's also a tweener, in my opinion. We'll pick it up in the next part. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
As mentioned, we'll continue ranking the presidents with Jeremi Suri and Jeffrey Engel. Who is the worst president in American history? That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.